When Mark saw his wife at the airport, his heart stopped. She was standing there with two strollers. Two tiny babies were sleeping peacefully. Both were black. His world collapsed in an instant. The only thought echoing in his head was, "What the hell?" Mark had been waiting in the arrivals hall for almost an hour. Even though he knew the flight was about to land, he kept glancing at the departures and arrivals board, but his eyes kept drifting toward the massive glass doors where passengers were emerging. His heart pounded harder with each passing second. A year without Emma had felt like an endless trial. He recalled their decision for her to go abroad for work because the pay was promising, offering them a chance to change their lives. They had dreamed of saving enough money for a new apartment, a stable future, a life free from endless debts. Mark comforted himself with the thought that the separation would only strengthen their love. Even today, he had brought along a massive bouquet of delicate lilies. He knew Emma loved them more than roses. She used to joke that roses were for the overly glamorous, while lilies were for those who appreciated subtlety and femininity. Remembering her words, Mark found himself smiling. He waited for the screen to show that the passengers from her flight had arrived, but his chest tightened as he imagined Emma running into his arms, whispering, "I'm back. Now everything will be different." He believed their year apart had been worth it, that the trials were behind them. Checking the board again, he noticed her flight had landed 10 minutes ago. Lifting his head, he scanned the crowd. Elderly couples, young mothers with children, exhausted travelers with mountains of luggage. None of them were her. And then, suddenly, he saw a woman pushing a baby stroller. At first, he didn't even recognize her. But the way she moved her hands, the familiar tilt of her head, the expression on her face, though worn and tired, told him it was her. For a split second, his heart leaped with joy. Finally, she was home. But then, in the next instant, his joy was swallowed by a wave of shock. Why was she pushing a stroller? They had no children. Nothing like this could have happened in the past year. Maybe she's helping someone? Maybe it's temporary? He thought, gripping the bouquet tighter in his hands. But the closer Emma got, the clearer it became. There were two babies in the stroller, and both were unmistakably black. His throat went dry. A scorching heat shot through his body, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Emma stopped right in front of him, slightly breathless and visibly nervous, as if she herself didn't know what to say or how to act. "Hi," she whispered, barely audible. You must be in shock." Mark could feel his own breath becoming unsteady. The flowers in his hands suddenly felt useless. He studied his wife. Her eyes were red, dark circles beneath them, and her face carried traces of fear and guilt. Then, he looked at the tiny babies wrapped in light blankets, sleeping soundly, completely unaware that their presence had just turned this family's world upside down. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt as though it had been filled with cement. "This is all," Emma tried to explain but trailed off. "I'll tell you later." Her voice was soft, pleading. Passers-by glanced at them, some with curiosity, others with sympathy, but most hurried past, caught up in their own lives. But for Mark, at that moment, the entire world had shrunk to just Emma, the stroller, and two babies whose presence made his mind spin. He realized he couldn't utter a single word. It was as if he was in a dream. Mechanically, he thrust the bouquet of flowers into Emma's hands, nearly dropping it to the floor. She grabbed it awkwardly, her eyes locked onto his, desperately searching for some trace of understanding or support. Mark swallowed hard, stepped back, and ran a shaky hand over his sweaty forehead. "Maybe this isn't real. Maybe I'm just losing my mind," he thought, struggling to find any logical explanation. The situation was so surreal that he almost wanted to believe that any second now, it would vanish like a bad hallucination. He remembered the months he had spent imagining this reunion, how things were supposed to be different. But now, all he could feel was a burning pain deep inside him and a growing fear of what answers awaited. "Let's go to the car," Mark finally managed to say, his voice hollow. He turned away, staring into the distance, avoiding her gaze. Then, Without waiting for a response, he started walking through the crowd. He felt his heart pounding in his chest. With each step, it became more clear. There was no going back to the life they had before. Everything had changed the moment she appeared with two babies that couldn't possibly be his. Emma hesitated but quickly followed, pushing the stroller carefully while clutching the bouquet, which was already slipping from her grasp. Mark didn't look back. His steps were tense, almost as if he was trying to escape. Not just from her, but from the terrifying realization that their future was no longer the perfect picture he had imagined. From the airport exit to the parking lot, they didn't say a word to each other. Only the distant hum of airplanes and snippets of passing conversations filled the silence between them. When Mark opened the trunk of his car, he caught a glimpse of Emma lifting one of the babies into her arms. The sight made his stomach twist. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. How could she do this? Why was this happening? But his pride and the sheer shock paralyzed him. "Get in," he muttered, opening the passenger door. Emma nodded, carefully placing the babies in their car seats. Her expression remained the same, guilt-ridden and exhausted. Mark slid into the driver's seat, mechanically buckling his seatbelt and inserting the key into the ignition. God, is this even real? The thought echoed in his head, but the reality was right in front of him. His wife, a twin stroller, two black infants, and an unbearable storm raging inside him. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine, like a quiet reminder that life was still moving forward, even if his illusions had just been shattered. Mark drove in complete silence, the tension in the car so thick it felt suffocating. Emma sat beside him, clutching one of the babies in her arms, while the other lay nestled in the stroller on the back seat, softly snoring in a half-sleep. Several times, she opened her mouth to speak, but every time she caught a glimpse of her husband's rigid posture. The way his jaw was clenched tight and his hands gripped the wheel like a vice, the words died on her lips. Neither of them spoke for the entire drive home. The weight of unspoken questions and the growing storm of emotions between them filled the small space of the car. Mark felt like if he so much as opened his mouth, all the anger, all the confusion, all the betrayal he felt inside would come raging out, unstoppable. When he finally pulled into their apartment complex's parking lot, he barely waited for the car to come to a full stop before throwing open the door and stepping out. His mind was in chaos. This couldn't be happening. Emma hesitated for a moment, then carefully unbuckled the babies, grabbing the stroller. As she stepped out, she looked around nervously. A few neighbors were outside, and the sight of Mark storming off ahead while she followed with two infants, visibly distressed, didn't go unnoticed. People whispered. Some exchanged looks. But Mark didn't care. He grabbed her suitcase from the trunk. Just a small one, far too little for someone who had been gone for a whole year. Then, without another word, he tossed it onto the pavement next to her and turned toward the building entrance. Emma looked down at the suitcase, then at the babies, and finally at Mark's back as he walked away without a single glance. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the blanket around the babies and hurried after him, the stroller wheels rattling against the pavement. By the time she reached their apartment door, Mark had already thrown his keys onto the hallway table and disappeared into the kitchen. He didn't even offer to help her bring in the stroller. He didn't even look at her. The weight of everything, her exhaustion, her fear, the reality of the mess she had brought home, crashed down on Emma's shoulders. Still, she didn't cry. Not yet. She carefully wheeled the stroller inside, closed the door behind her, and stood there, uncertain. From the kitchen, she heard Mark pull out a chair and sit down heavily. The sound of him exhaling sharply, as if trying to regain some control over his emotions, reached her ears. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the stroller toward the corner of the living room and gently checked on the babies. They were still asleep, peaceful. She wished she could be, too. Gathering herself, she finally walked toward the kitchen. Mark sat at the table, his back slightly hunched, fingers running through his hair. His bouquet of lilies was nowhere to be seen. The tension in the air was suffocating. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Emma took a step forward and whispered, "Mark, Can we talk? At first, he didn't even react. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and looked at her. His eyes were unreadable, cold, distant. Talk? He repeated, voice hoarse from holding back emotions. You want to talk? Emma swallowed hard. Yes, she said softly. I know how this looks. But, no. Mark cut her off sharply, his voice dropping lower. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. You don't know how this looks, Emma. She froze. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I waited for you, he muttered, his voice tight with barely contained fury. For a year. A whole damn year. I counted the days until you came back. His fists clenched against the table. And then you show up at the airport with 2 babies that aren't mine. Emma took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Mark, please. What the hell did you expect me to do? He cut her off again. Smile? Hug you? Pretend this is normal? Emma felt her throat tighten. I was going to tell you. When, Emma. His voice rose, but he forced himself to stay quiet. When was the right time? Because the moment you walked through those airport doors, my whole world collapsed. Emma's fingers curled into the fabric of her sleeves. I didn't plan for this, she whispered. Mark let out another bitter laugh. Oh, I believe you, he said coldly. Because if you had, maybe you'd have had the decency to tell me before I found out this way. Emma flinched. She wanted to tell him everything. She needed to tell him everything. But the way he was looking at her, like she was a stranger, like she was someone he didn't even recognize anymore, made her heart ache. She took another step closer. I know you're angry, she said quietly, and I don't blame you. But please, Mark, just let me explain. Mark stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and exhaled through his nose. Fine, he said. Talk. Emma swallowed. She knew there was no way to make this easy. So she took a deep breath, sat down across from him, and finally began to tell him the truth. Emma clasped her hands together on the table, her fingers twisting nervously as she tried to find the right words. Mark sat across from her, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable, except for the storm raging in his eyes. Taking a shaky breath, she started. When I first got to Italy, everything seemed fine. I had a job, a decent employer, and I thought it would all be worth it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We needed the money, and I told myself that a year apart wasn't so long, that we could handle it. Mark didn't react, didn't move, didn't say a word. He was just watching her. Emma swallowed hard and continued. But then things changed, she said. My employer's business started failing. He couldn't afford to keep me on, so I was let go. I thought I'd find another job right away. But I didn't. I was alone in a foreign country with no income, no way to pay rent, and no way to even afford a ticket home. A shadow passed over Mark's face. He hadn't thought about it before. What it must have been like for her to be stranded, powerless. But the anger inside him was still stronger than any flicker of sympathy. I tried everything, Emma went on. But every job I found paid almost nothing, and I was running out of time. Then I met Mr. Moretti. Mark's jaw tightened. He was wealthy, powerful. He had a huge house and a family that barely even noticed him, Emma said, her voice laced with something dark. He offered me a job taking care of his elderly mother. Seemed perfect. Good pay, a place to stay. But it wasn't long before I realized that he wasn't the kind of man I thought he was. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want to guess what she meant. He wanted to hear it. Emma's voice grew quieter. He started acting strange around me. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But then the comments started. The touches that lasted too long. The way he looked at me when he thought no one else was watching. She paused, fingers gripping each other so tightly, her knuckles turned white. And then one night he told me outright, if I wanted to keep my job, I'd have to give him more than just my time as a caretaker. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Emma looked away. "I refused," she said, her voice almost breaking. "I told him no. I thought that would be the end of it. But instead, he made sure I had nowhere else to go. He spread rumors so I couldn't find another job. He made it impossible for me to leave." Mark's mind was spinning. He had spent so many months picturing his wife working in a safe, stable job, and now she was telling him that she had been trapped, manipulated. But none of this explained the babies. "You could have called me," he said finally, his voice low. "You could have told me what was happening." Emma let out a shaky laugh, but there was no humor in it. "And then what?" she asked, looking at him with tired, desperate eyes. "Would you have been able to send me enough money for a plane ticket? Would you have magically made it possible for me to leave? Mark, we were already drowning in debt. You were barely holding things together on your own." She had a point, and Mark hated it. Still, the fact remained, none of this explained the children. Mark let out a slow breath. "Fine," he said. "So he tried to trap you. He made your life hell. But that doesn't explain why you walked off that plane today with 2 babies that aren't mine." Emma flinched. She had known this moment was coming. Closing her eyes for a second, she gathered the strength to say it out loud. "They're not mine either," she whispered. Mark froze. "What?" Emma forced herself to meet his gaze. "They're not my children," she repeated, stronger this time. "I didn't give birth to them." Mark's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind racing. "Then who the hell?" "They belong to his son," Emma said quickly, cutting him off. "Mr. Moretti's son, Alessandro. He was married to a woman from Ghana, and she got pregnant with twins. But during the pregnancy, she got sick. Really sick." Mark's throat felt dry, but he didn't interrupt. "When she gave birth, she didn't survive," Emma continued, her voice shaking slightly. "And Alessandro, he didn't want the babies. He disappeared. Left them behind." Mark felt sick. Moretti, the rich man, the one who had trapped Emma in his house. He called them worthless. He said they were not his problem. She went on bitterly. "And since I was the only woman in the house, guess who was suddenly expected to take care of them?" Mark didn't move, didn't breathe. Emma let out a heavy breath. "At first, I thought it would only be temporary," she admitted. "That he'd come back, that the family would step in. But they didn't. No one did. And Moretti didn't care if they starved." The realization sank into Mark like a punch to the gut. "So what, you just decided to bring them home?" he asked, his voice hollow. Emma looked down at the table, nodding. "I had no choice," she whispered. "I couldn't leave them there. And when Moretti got sick and had a stroke, the house fell into chaos. No one was paying attention anymore. So I took the babies and ran." Mark felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He had assumed the worst, that Emma had cheated, that she had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Instead, she had been a prisoner. And when she finally escaped, she hadn't just saved herself. She had saved them too. The silence between them stretched long and heavy. Emma hesitated, then reached across the table, placing her hand lightly over his. "I know this isn't what you expected," she said softly. "I know you're angry and confused, and I don't blame you. But Mark, please, I need you to understand." He didn't pull away, but he didn't grip her hand either. His mind was too full, too heavy with thoughts, emotions, questions. All this time he had been ready to hate her, to turn his back on her completely, and now he didn't know what to feel. He just knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Mark sat in silence, his mind a battlefield of emotions. He had spent the last 12 hours convinced that Emma had betrayed him, that she had returned with children who were the product of an affair. But the truth was even more complicated. She hadn't just fought for survival. She had fought for them. His wife had been trapped in a nightmare. And when she finally escaped, she didn't come back empty-handed. She came back with 2 innocent lives depending on her. But that didn't mean he could just accept it. Mark let out a slow breath, pulling his hand away from hers. He wasn't sure if it was rejection or just self-defense, but touching her felt too much like surrendering. Emma's face fell, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she waited. Finally, Mark spoke. "So, what now?" His voice was hoarse, exhausted. "You expect me to just accept this?" Emma exhaled through her nose, rubbing her temple. "No," she admitted. "I don't expect that. I don't even know what I expect. But I do know that I can't abandon them, Mark. I won't." His stomach twisted. He had spent a year imagining this moment. Her coming home, running into his arms, whispering that they would finally be okay. But this wasn't that moment. Nothing was okay, and it wouldn't be for a long time. Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers running through his hair. "Do you even understand what you're asking of me?" Emma flinched, but she nodded. "I do." His jaw tightened. "You want me to be a father to someone else's kids." Emma's breath hitched. "They don't have anyone else," she whispered. Mark closed his eyes. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? If they had someone else, anyone else, this wouldn't even be a conversation. Emma could have left them behind. Someone else could have taken them in. But that didn't happen. And now he was looking at a future he never asked for. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Emma, this wasn't our plan. I know. We wanted our own kids. I know. We wanted a fresh start. I know. Then why?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Why did you bring them here?" Emma blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears. "Because I couldn't leave them." Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. "Because when I looked at them, I saw how easily they could be forgotten. I saw how the world would move on without them." She swallowed hard. "And I thought about us, about all the things we wanted, about how much we fought just to have a shot at a better life." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "And I thought, if it were me, if I were abandoned like that, wouldn't I want someone to fight for me?" Mark felt something crack inside him, because deep down he knew exactly what she meant. He had spent his entire childhood waiting for someone to fight for him. His father never had. His mother never had. No one ever did. And now 2 children had been left behind in the same way. Still, it wasn't that simple. "You're asking me to give up the life we planned," he said finally. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "I'm asking you to see that maybe, just maybe, this could be a different kind of life. One we didn't expect, but one that could still be good." Mark looked away. He didn't answer, because he didn't know if he could. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling the same impossible question. Could he do this? Could he raise 2 children who weren't his? Could he move past the anger, the betrayal, the loss of the future he had once imagined? From the bedroom, he could hear Emma moving, hear the soft cries of the babies as she rocked them back to sleep. The sound twisted in his chest, pressing against the part of him that didn't want to care. But he did, and that terrified him the most. By morning, the house was filled with the quiet hum of a life he hadn't agreed to. Emma sat in the living room, holding one of the babies while the other lay in the stroller, blinking up at the ceiling. She looked up when Mark entered. She looked exhausted, and he hated that he noticed. He cleared his throat. "I need time," he said. Emma nodded, even though her shoulders sagged. "I understand." Mark rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't know if I can do this, Emma." Her fingers curled around the blanket wrapped around the baby. "I know," she whispered. A silence stretched between them. Then, softly, almost cautiously, Emma asked, "Can you at least hold him?" Mark's breath caught. Emma lifted the baby just slightly, not forcing, not pleading, just offering. And against his better judgment, against the voice in his head screaming that he wasn't ready, Mark took a step forward, then another, and then he reached out his arms. Mark had held babies before, his friends' kids, his cousin's newborn once at a family gathering. But this was different. This wasn't just holding a baby. This was holding a decision. As soon as Emma carefully placed the infant into his arms, Mark felt his muscles tense. The baby was so small, his weight barely noticeable, yet it felt immense. His tiny fingers twitched against the blanket, his dark brown eyes wide open, staring up at Mark with a silent curiosity. Mark's breath hitched. The baby didn't cry. He didn't squirm. He just looked. Emma watched, her lips slightly parted as if she was afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. Mark should have felt anger. He should have felt resentment, a burning sense of this isn't mine. This isn't what I wanted. Instead, all he felt was fear. Not fear of the child himself, fear of what it meant. Because the second he let himself feel anything for this baby, he would never be able to walk away. And that terrified him more than anything. Emma saw the shift in his face, the subtle flicker of something breaking inside him. "His name is Leo," she said softly. Mark's gaze snapped up to hers. "Leo?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "And the other one is Noah." Mark turned his head slightly, looking over at the stroller where the second baby was lying, his tiny chest rising and falling in sleep. Leo, Noah, they had names. Names meant permanence. Names meant belonging. Mark's grip on the baby tightened slightly, protective without realizing it. Emma's breath shuddered out. "You don't have to decide now," she said, her voice gentle. "I know this isn't fair to you. I know this wasn't what we planned." Mark swallowed hard. Planned. Planned was a life where Emma came home, they celebrated, and they started building the family they had always talked about. But life had thrown this at them instead. And now he had to decide if he could live with it. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting Leo slightly in his arms. The baby yawned, his tiny mouth stretching before he nestled against Mark's chest, eyes fluttering closed. The warmth against his heart sent a jolt through him. Emma must have seen the way he stiffened, the way something almost unnoticeable changed in his expression. But she didn't say anything. She just waited. And for the first time since she had stepped off that plane, Mark realized something. Emma hadn't come home expecting forgiveness. She hadn't expected him to instantly accept any of this. She just wanted him to try. He let out a long, slow breath, his arms tightening slightly around Leo. He wasn't ready. He didn't know if he would ever be ready. But for now, he could do this. Just this. He could hold the baby. He could sit in this moment. He could let himself feel. And for the first time since his world had shattered, Mark felt the slightest flicker of something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not betrayal, not even resentment, just the smallest, quietest whisper of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as broken as he thought. Mark sat still, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall of Leo's tiny chest against him. The warmth, the weight, the reality. He had spent so long resenting Emma for what he thought she had done, for the betrayal he had convinced himself was real. But the truth had been something entirely different. She hadn't betrayed him. She had been trapped. And when she finally got out, she hadn't just saved herself. She had saved them. Mark's fingers twitched slightly, adjusting the blanket around Leo's small body. The baby gave a soft sigh in his sleep, nuzzling instinctively against Mark's chest. It was such a small thing, such a tiny, fragile movement. And yet, it broke something inside him. Emma was watching him carefully, like she was afraid to move, afraid to push him too far. "I don't expect you to have an answer right now," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't have one." Emma nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as suffocating as before. It wasn't the sharp-edged, unbearable silence of last night, or the cold distance of the drive home. This silence was quieter, softer, filled with something undecided. Mark finally exhaled, shifting Leo slightly so he could rest against the crook of his arm instead. The baby's face was relaxed, peaceful, completely unaware of the storm surrounding him. And for the first time, Mark wondered what that meant. What it meant that this baby didn't belong to him, but still fit so perfectly in his arms. Emma bit her lip, hesitating. "I know this wasn't what we wanted," she whispered. "I know I changed everything by bringing them here. But Mark, if you need time, take it. I won't pressure you." Mark let out a slow breath, nodding. "Time. That was the only thing he could ask for right now. Because whatever came next, whatever he decided, there would be no going back. That night, Mark lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. Every thought, every possibility, every road his life could take from here. In the quiet darkness of their small apartment, he could hear Emma in the next room, whispering to the babies as she rocked them back to sleep. Her voice was soft, almost musical, like a lullaby. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since she had come home, the thought of her being here didn't feel like a nightmare. Felt like something else, something he wasn't ready to name, but maybe, just maybe, something he wasn't entirely ready to lose. Morning came too quickly. Mark hadn't slept much, maybe an hour or two at most. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to stop racing. By the time he finally pulled himself up from the couch, the apartment was already stirring. The soft sounds of Emma moving in the kitchen, the quiet murmur of her voice as she spoke to the babies. For a moment he just stood there. He wasn't ready to face her. He wasn't ready to face any of this. But at the same time he couldn't keep running from it either. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the kitchen. Emma was standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot, oatmeal, judging by the smell. Her hair was still messy from sleep, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, but when she turned and saw him standing there, she still gave a small, tentative smile. "Morning," she said softly. Mark nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Morning." He wasn't sure what else to say. His eyes drifted to the stroller in the corner. Leo and Noah were awake. Leo was staring up at the ceiling, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling. Noah was sucking on his fist, making little content noises as he squirmed in his blanket. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. They really were just babies, completely innocent, completely unaware of the chaos their presence had caused. Emma noticed him looking and hesitated. "I know this is a lot," she said quietly, "and I don't want to push you, but I do need to ask." Mark tensed. "Ask what?" Emma swallowed. "What are you going to do?" Mark let out a slow breath. That was the question, wasn't it? What was he going to do? Was he going to leave? Was he going to stay? Was he going to try? His eyes flickered back to the babies. Leo, Noah. Two tiny lives that had been abandoned before they even had a chance. And now, somehow, their fate rested on him. Mark didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to make a decision he couldn't take back. So instead of answering, he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, and reached for the stroller. Emma's breath caught. Mark bent down, hesitated for only a second, then carefully scooped Noah into his arms. The baby blinked up at him, his tiny mouth still sucking on his fist. Mark's chest felt too tight, like it was filled with something he didn't know how to name. He turned back to Emma, meeting her eyes. "I don't know what I'm going to do," he admitted. "But I'm still here." Emma exhaled shakily. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The days passed in a blur. Mark hadn't made a decision yet. Not completely. But he hadn't left either. Instead, he just existed. He went through the motions. Woke up. Went to work. Came home. And every day, he told himself that he would figure it out tomorrow. But tomorrow kept turning into another day. And then another. And somehow a week passed. A week of quiet tension. A week of small, unspoken changes. A week of him slowly, without meaning to, becoming a part of this strange new reality. Because no matter how much he tried to resist it, he was already involved. It was in the little things, like how he found himself checking on the babies when Emma wasn't looking, or how he started recognizing the difference between their cries, or how one night, when Emma had collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to function, Mark had reached into the stroller and lifted Leo into his arms without thinking, and the baby had stopped crying immediately. Emma had watched from across the room, her eyes shining with something he couldn't face yet, so he had pretended not to notice. But he did. One night, Mark found himself sitting on the couch, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. Emma was in the other room, putting the babies to sleep. And for the first time, he let himself really ask the question. Could he do this? Could he be the kind of man who stayed? The kind of man who raised children that weren't his? The kind of man he never had growing up? Mark didn't know. But maybe he wanted to find out. The second week came and went. Mark still hadn't made a final decision, but his actions spoke louder than his words. He found himself staying up late when the babies cried, even when Emma told him he didn't have to. He caught himself watching them, noticing little things. How Leo always fell asleep with his tiny fingers curled into a fist. How Noah's eyes searched the room as if trying to memorize everything. And the more he noticed, the more he realized he wasn't detached anymore. This wasn't just Emma's problem. It was his too. One evening, after work, he walked into the apartment and heard Emma humming softly from the nursery. The sound stopped him in his tracks. He had missed this. Missed the simple, quiet warmth of coming home to someone. For a whole year, their apartment had felt empty, hollow. Now it was full, messy, loud, overwhelming, but not empty. He exhaled through his nose and stepped into the room. Emma was standing by the crib, rocking Noah gently. She turned when she saw him, offering a small, uncertain smile. "Hey," she whispered. Mark hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he said the words that had been building in his chest for days. "I'm staying." Emma froze. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening around Noah's tiny body. Mark swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. "I don't know what this means yet," he admitted. "I don't know if I can be what they need, but I want to try." Emma blinked rapidly. For a second, she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she let out a breath that sounded like relief. "Okay," she whispered. Mark met her eyes, and for the first time since she had come home, he didn't feel trapped. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be.